Yeah, good morning. My name is Marco. I'm a full stack developer and open source contributor. And if you haven't met already, let's connect after the talk. Today I want to talk about developer tooling for the modern Hotwire and Rails era. And I want to see what we can do to level up the game in the Hotwire ecosystem. So I want to talk about what it means to build an LSP. We want to understand them. I want to showcase with the Stimulus LSP what it means to have an LSP or how to build one, and then what's next for tooling in that space. So I've been maintaining Stimulus Reflex and Cape Ready for the past few years, and I've also been maintaining Stimulus over the past couple of years. And personally, I love open source. I am really delighted to get the honor to open source and contribute and maintain libraries. That's why I've been trying to help out with anything that's Hotwire related or front end or Rails, any of that sort. So if you see a project here that you are using in any of your projects, I would love to hear how you're using them. So I actively started to contribute back in 2019, and I, at the time, was using React at a company. And I personally like React. It's more about the architecture around it usually that's really what bothers me or what makes it super complex for me to understand what's going on. So quite frankly, I had enough of doing that kind of work, and I want to get back to Ruby and writing actual Ruby codes, writing Rails codes, and also more importantly, writing Rails and Hotwire code in the same code base. Because to me, it feels like it gives me some kind of superpower to just build whatever I want or need, and that's really what I'm all after. And I think it's the future of modern Rails apps in a way, now that it's also default in Rails 7 and forward. So it's really cool to see this approach gaining more traction. So I went full time to work on these projects from like 2022 to 2023 for 1.5 years or so, just because I had fun doing it. And yeah, to just work on these projects and help wherever I can. But while doing so, I noticed something. React had a bunch of awesome tooling in JavaScript in general as well. So the developer experience in JavaScript tooling is really awesome. And I was quite missing that in Rails in a way. It didn't seem like we had anything like that in Ruby. Yes, there was Solgraph, but I never got it to work really properly in my application or my setup. So I always kind of left this out. I couldn't really get it to work for me. So I started to miss these awesome tools that I saw in JavaScript, but I was wondering if we can bring those back to Rails or make Rails better. I'm one of these people who doesn't use an IDE. Somehow they always felt clunky and heavyweight for me to use. I don't know why. And somehow they made me feel like I'm less productive in a way. I don't know. It's very weird. I don't know. But in the last few years, it quite changed a bit, I think. We had some kind of elder evolution going on, and I think that's thanks to the language server protocol, or LSP for short. So what is LSP and why would we want to use it? It's a way of providing language intelligence to our application or our tooling without the need for an actual IDE. So we can build one server and have it consumed in all our editors. As previously, you would have to build a plugin for VS Code, Atom, Vim, or whatever you were using, and the combination of plugins and tools you had to build was really high. And with LSP, this is all pretty much simplified to one implementation, and everybody who speaks the protocol can just use it as well. So how does it work? Whenever you open a file in your editor starts a process per language once, and it keeps running in the background as long as that file or this project is open. It usually communicates over standard in and standard out. There's also an option to do it over TCP/IP, but usually it's standard in, standard out. And it uses a protocol called JSON RPC. If you aren't familiar with JSON RPC, it's somewhat similar to HTTP in the way that you also have the content length, the headers up top, and then a body. In this case, it's a JSON blob that you can send back and forth. So coming back to Stimulus, I wanted to build a Stimulus LSP. But what do we actually want to solve here? So this is the most basic example of a stimulus snippet from the whole page. And what we want to look at is the data attributes here. So the data controllers, the targets, the actions, and so on. These are the ones that we want to help help the developer with by providing autocomplete or diagnostics and so on. So whenever you are writing a div or any kind of template, you want to get autocomplete for all the attributes you have available. And for some of them, we might need more information for the identifier or the classes and so on. So you autocomplete an attribute, and when you did that, you want to get the possible values for this attribute now. So you get something like this where you also autocomplete this. But if you have been using stimulus, you might know that there's some conventions and sometimes they are not as straightforward as you would think. So this is actually not valid in stimulus. It's technically an underscore that you have to use for this. And to me, it happened so many times that I felt like we have to improve that and how we build these applications. So I thought we can do better. And back in 2021, I just had this idea of, yeah, let's try to build one and see what it might take to make this work. So I looked it up online and found this guide for building an extension. They had really awesome examples on GitHub, really documented well. And I looked at this basic example where it just gave you a basic text document and an autocomplete for just some elements here in a text file. So let's see how this example works. So when you open this file, your client or your editor will send a request to the server. In this case, it's a completion request. And alongside, it sends some attributes like the path, the file you have open, where the current cursor is, and a few more things. And then the server can do pretty much anything, but in the end, it has to return a JSON response. And in this case, it returns a blob of JSON here, where we have results and some static items in here. And by receiving this from the client again, we get this autocomplete pop-up, as you probably know it from VS Code. So coming back to stimulus, we have a very similar idea here, but we have the difference that we are in HTML. We need to have the context in where we are in the current document, and we need to know what we are trying to complete at any given time. And this is a little bit different because we are using HTML, and we are trying to embed a language into HTML because stimulus, like all the attributes, are not part of the HTML spec, so VS Code doesn't know anything about this and how it might be used. So we need a way to extend the HTML handling in VS Code or HTML-like documents because we are using most of the time HTML ERB, right? And luckily we can do this with language services. And the question now comes, which language do you write this language service in? There's some obvious choices like TypeScript or JavaScript, but since we all are Rubyists, we would love to write this in Ruby, right? The reality is, though, that Stimulus, or I guess Hotwire in general, can be used across many stacks, and it always felt weird to me that you would have to have Ruby installed in your system just to use the language server. And because I wanted to have this portability aspect, I wanted to reuse the existing tools that are available, I, in the end, opted for TypeScript. And because we want to reuse stuff that already exists, VS Code provides this language service for HTML we can use. And what it does, it gives us a data provider, what they call. A data provider is pretty much just a JavaScript class that you can implement. And by implementing this, it will do the kind of magic behind the scenes for you. So let's try to implement this for Stimulus. There's a provide tags method, meaning we can extend the tags for HTML that it knows about. But since we are using Stimulus, we don't use any special tags because we just use the attributes. We can just implement this with returning an empty array. We don't really care about this part of the implementation. But we care about the attributes that are available. And we get the tag, but then again, we don't really care about the tag necessarily, but we want to complete these kind of attributes. Let's look at the first two because they are static and they are easy and straightforward to implement. So what we want to do is we want to return a list of the attributes we know about. So in this case, we just return an array with items like the data controller and data action. And now we want to look at how we can implement the rest of them. There are some dynamic parts we need to interpolate, so we need to parse JavaScript, or more specifically, we need to parse the stimulus controllers in our app so we know what exists and what we can provide as autocomplete values. So I'm going to add a new class to my project. It's called controller definition. It's a representation of a controller in my app. And we have a path of where the controller is. We have the method, targets, and so on, whatever stimulus APIs provides. And this holds a representation of one of these controllers. And we're going to use Acorn, a JavaScript parser, for parsing our JavaScript files. And what we do is we implement the new parser class. We implement a parse controller method, which takes in the whole file content and the path of where this file is. And if you look at an example controller here, this hello controller, we have this controller here. And what we really care about is the targets up top and the methods or the actions in the controller itself. So we write a script to loop over all our controllers in our app JavaScript controllers directory, and then loop over them, read them out one by one, and then pass in the content and the path into our parser class and parse controller method. And then in our methods, we are going to parse the code so we get back an abstract syntax tree, which we then can traverse to see what is in that file. So we create a new instance of a control definition, the class we made earlier, and then we try to traverse the whole tree and look for method definitions. And wherever we find one of these definitions, we take the name of that and push it into our control methods array. And with that, we have pretty much parsed all the actions in our controller. We used something very similar for our targets. And what we get for this controller then, instance that looks like this, where we have the path, the methods, the targets, and so on. So now we have the basic representation that we can use to interpolate these values here. So this is where we left off earlier. We have the static control and action. And what we want to do is we want to loop over all our controllers we found, take their identifier, interpolate it to be data identifier targets, then spread them back into the array we want to return. And with that, we get this autocomplete here, where we have the actions, the controllers, and in this case, we have one controller, and therefore we have the data hello target available here as well. So that's the basic idea of completing the attributes. But now you have an attribute, and you want to provide the values for it. In this case, you want to provide all the possible controllers that we have in our application. So we also get a method for that, provide values, and we get the attribute passed in we are trying to complete. So whenever we see a data controller attribute, we can return a list of all the identifiers we know and kind of check this off the list right away. But if we don't match this attribute, we can check for the presence of a target. And where we find a target, we can see if we have a controller available, and if we do, we return the targets for that controller. And with implementing this, we get something like that, where we have the controllers, and it gives us all the identifiers in our app. And when you're trying to complete a target for the hello controller, it gives you the two available targets on this controller. So this was the basic idea. This was the proof of concept I had. And that's what I kind of pushed up in, I guess, in night of work. And then a few days later, I was coming back to this and thought, is this really something people would want? And I started asking around for some of my friends. And I sent them a demo of what I showed you pretty much just now. And I was really kind of surprised that they were really keen to that. And I was like, yeah, there's so much potential. Let's see what else we can do and where we can go with this. And now you might be asking, can't AI do all of that today? And I would say maybe. I feel like there are different use cases for this. For me, right now, boilerplate is more the typical use case I use AI for. But LSPs I want to use for reliability and accuracy. Meaning, we have a limited context window for all these AIs, right? And what's missing right now, from what I can tell, is that we don't have the connection between a stimulus controller file and the view file, and it doesn't know how to connect or read between those to make that really reliable today. But even if you would have all of the complete with AI today, I feel like diagnostics are something that really is valuable nonetheless. Because if you complete, or let the AI complete, it might generate some code that does not write. But if the LSP can tell you there's something wrong with your codes, you can then try to fix it and see what makes sense in your app. And the motivation for this was something like I like in Ruby. When I always come back, I see that it always gives you this did you mean suggestions in the code when you try to call a method that doesn't exist. And I thought we can apply the same thing to stimulus when we have a control that we referenced that we don't know about, but we have something very similar in our app, then we can just prompt the user to say, did you mean fill to dash checkbox in this case? The same is true that we can do for actions, for targets, for values, and so on. And that's the idea for trying to be as nice about this so they can tell you right away when something is wrong with your code. So what else can we do with this? If we know what's wrong with the code and if we know how we can fix it, we can try to provide an action to the user so they can just apply that change. Which is why you have these quick fix actions where you can say, please replace this with this value we found, or if you just try to create a new controller, we can create the controller for you with the boilerplate and everything already in there at the right location in your application. So fast forward to October 2023, I was presenting at Rails World last year and announced this LSP to the world after like 2 years of working on it. And I got a lot of feedback because I also asked the community for feedback. And I noticed that I really started to, there were some ideas and some concepts we were using that didn't really work well. So a lot of the naive approaches we were using started to fall short in a way, especially in the way we were passing JavaScript with Acorn. One thing was that we assumed and hard-coded this path in our Rails apps where usually the controllers are, but it turns out that not all of the people are using this exact path for controllers. So we had to fix that. The other thing is there are different ways of registering controllers in your application, stimulus controllers. This is the way we do it in import maps, but if you have been doing Rails front in the past few years, you might know that there are different ways, a lot of different ways to bundle and organize a JavaScript in Rails apps. And somehow we had to support that too. So this took a lot of effort to make all of that compatible with it as well. So the idea is that the language server works now, but sometimes you get false positive or inaccurate results, which is really annoying to the users. So if I want it to be accurate and reliable, I don't want this kind of false positives in my experience. So we addressed a lot of these issues and fixed a bunch of bugs, and technically ended up rewriting the whole parser. It's a lot more complex now, but it's more reliable and more accurate now. And now fast forward to earlier this year in May, we were able to release this new Stimulus parser package, which then powered this whole release of Stimulus LSP 1.0, where we had support for TypeScript, NPM packages, and a lot of other awesome features. So with all of that, what's next in that space? RubyMine a few weeks ago released support for Stimulus, which is really awesome to see that they are also picking up on supporting Stimulus and these kind of technologies. So that's really awesome to see. But also we have a lot of these diagnostics now in our LSP, but none of this is technically exclusive to an LSP. We could use these diagnostics independent of the LSP itself. So we can try to extract that in a tool, kind of like a tool as Euruko does, where we can run these tools. And that's why I was working on Stimulus Lint the past few weeks. So we get all these diagnostics, these errors and best practice and recommendations as part of that package. So you can run this as like a local CLI or as part of your CI system to check for obvious references for stimulus controls or other things. And the other thing we don't really support right now is HTML and ERB documents. We want to provide the same diagnostics and code actions for ERB as well, when we were using Rails tag helpers, for example, and that's something we don't do today. And similarly, we had a pre-release of a Turbo LSP, which was the most basic example we could think of, which is available as today as well. But the problem with Turbo is that it also relies heavily on view helpers and ERB, that we need to understand those. So we can only really provide intelligence if we know how to understand ERB. So Stimulus understands HTML in ERB documents, but it doesn't really understand embedded Ruby that outputs HTML. And last year I had this slide up where I had this point here where it says we want to support Turbo LSP and the Ruby LSP supports ERB. And through that, Winnie reached out, he's working on the Ruby LSP, to see if we can make that somehow work. And funny enough, we were able to work on this at RubyConf on the Hack Day in last year. And we tried to come up with a basic proof of concept to see what we can do with that. But we also noticed that there is a lot more that we need to do if you want to go beyond the basics. So what we tried to do was this approach where we had this whole document. But what we are doing is we're trying to strip out all the HTML parts. And with that, we just have the Ruby code left. And when we just have the Ruby code left, we can use a regular Ruby parser to understand what's going on here. And this shipped a few weeks ago thanks to Stan's contribution in Ruby LSP. And if you haven't been using Ruby LSP, I really encourage you to check out this article, which showcases a bunch of the major highlights from Ruby LSP in the last half year. Coming back to this whole process of stripping out the HTML attributes, we lost the whole context of where we are interpolating. And most of the times it really matters where you are interpolating in your documents. If you are interpolating within a tag or within a value or not within a tag at all, is very important information that we need to care about. So we have HTML with embedded Ruby that we want to support or understand. But ERB is versatile. It doesn't need to be specifically be used for HTML. You can also use it for emails or other things. So there's nothing really that ties ERB to HTML itself. Which is why I was kind of experimenting with the idea of writing HTML via ERB parser, which needs a lot more exploration and see what we can do with it. But it's an idea that I just wanted to see what's possible with it. It could power these three tools: Stimulus LSP, Stimulus Lint, Turbo LSP, and maybe even the Ruby LSP at some point, or other tools as well. So what we want to understand is this kind of syntax, where we are using Rails tag helpers, the content tag, the tag.diff, if we are using DOM IDs, if we have conditionals, if we have the data syntax with the hash to add attributes and so on. So we need I need to have some kind of abstraction for this. And in the end, what we want to do is pretty much treat this the same way, so it looks no different to the parser if it knows how to map it back to the actual source code. The same is true for this. These two examples should be treated the same way if they are not really interpolating any other Ruby values and are just using strings. So this needs a lot more exploration, but I feel like there's something to this that could make all of these tools a lot better. And this might also open up the possibility to support other templated languages like Haml, Slim, Liquid, or whatever else you have. If we can map the same syntax to the same abstraction, and when we would have that, we could also provide some kind of language service, as we saw earlier with the HTML one, where you could provide HTML templating language service or an ERB language service that does the hard work behind the scenes for you. So you can implement all the diagnostics and that stuff on top of it. And the other thing is, if the parser would understand the Rails render calls really well, we could also provide more advanced diagnostics. So if you look at this example here, we need to put the target within our controller containing element. So if you put this outside of the element, we could say today that you are referencing a target which is not within a controller. We could do that. But realistically, modern Rails apps are composed of multiple views, partials, components. And what might end up happening is that you have the controller in a different file than the target. And there's no way for us to really traverse these views, how they relate to each other. And it makes it really hard for a tool like an LSP to understand how these files relate to each other. But if the parser would understand that logic and how that works, we could even provide diagnostics across files, where we could also annotate here that something is wrong because you are not doing this within the actual controller element. And I think the nature-aware parser for this could be really helpful for these kinds of situations. It could power these tools again, and there are a lot of other tools and gems that I saw along the way while researching a lot of this, which might even benefit from this work too, if done right. And I don't know, maybe there's even a possibility for a good AAV formatter, which I haven't found one today, until today, or a nice linter that works for all kinds of things that are concerns HTML and ERB. The Ruby parser Prism had a big effect on the landscape of all the tooling for Ruby. And I think that this parser could have a similar effect for all the templating tooling around Rails and Hotwire. And there's one last thing I want to talk about, which is the Hotwire browser extension. So a few years ago, Matt Swanson tweeted this, and he was doing a CSS hack where you had the turbo frames, and it would show the IDs of the frames in the top left corner, and kind of surrounds the whole frame in a border, so you know where the frames are on your page. And I really liked this idea, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and he just cooked up a browser extension in the meantime, and this is available today as well. It works in all the major browsers, and what it does is it gives you this panel, and you can turn off all the different tools in it for highlighting frames, for highlighting controllers, and a lot of other different things. So when you are browsing Stack Overflow, for example, I just found this by accident, you can see that all the outlined parts here are actually stimulus controllers. So Stack Overflow is using stimulus controllers for almost all the interactions on the page itself. And you can see in the bottom right corner which the controllers are that they are using on this specific page. And I have some sneak peeks here for what's coming next. We have been working on trying to figure out how we can visualize which buttons on a page are targeting a frame on the page, so you know when you click this button it will interact with this frame here. But as you can see on this screenshot here, it might lead to some weird edge cases where you don't really see what's going on the page anymore. So we have to find a way of making this more easy to look at. We had a similar tool in Stimulus Reflex a few years ago, where we had the interaction part that on the page that you could click on. It would show you which views it would re-render, and it would also show you which element on the page it would update once it's completed. And we would love to bring this same tooling to Turbo, so we have that available here as well. There are some other ideas for a stream debug bar. If you have been using Turbo streams, you might know that they are executing very quickly, and sometimes it's really hard to actually catch them and see what's going on. So it really helps if you can stop and step through the streams themselves to see what's actually going on in the application if you want to debug something. Another thing we have been thinking about is when you have a turbo frame with a source attributes, it would be cool if you can just click this reload button to reload the content of that page or that frame without having to reload the whole page itself. There are a lot of more ideas on the roadmap that we want to work on, but as I said, it's a work in progress. And if you have any ideas or see a use case that you have been struggling with Hotwire, I would love to hear it, and then we can see if we can integrate this into the dev tools as well. So to conclude, I think the double ergonomics and double experience matter, and I think it's really important for us that we can provide that so you have a nice experience writing your code. And personally, I feel like this is the tooling we have been missing for the past few years, but we are getting these tools slowly now, and it's really exciting. And I think there's so much potential to level up and make these tools even better. So I'm so excited for the future of these tools, and I believe that these kinds of tools are also what keeps a language or a framework somewhat relevant. Or I guess put differently, these tools are necessary for a modern day that you feel like this is a modern framework. If you don't have these tools, you don't feel like you are working in a modern framework. At least that's what I have been experiencing from talking to new people coming to Rails, that they are missing the tooling altogether. And personally, I want to keep building Rails and Hotwire apps, and that's why I want to keep building these tools, so I can keep building with Ruby and Rails. So if this is anything interesting to you, then I have been running a Hotwire weekly newsletter where I've been trying to round up what's happening in the world of Hotwire, kind of a focused newsletter just for that. It's coming out every Sunday, and if that's interesting to you, you can sign up on the socials or sign up on hotwireweekly.com. So I'm here to stand in for a more productive Hotwire ecosystem, and I want to stand in for a more unified ecosystem so we get the best tools to build our best applications we can think of. If you have any questions, ideas, or thoughts, come find me. And if you like stickers, I have these with me too. So that's all I have. Thank you.